Continuing Edith Hamilton's Mythology, Timeless Tales of Gods and Heroes. Introduction to Classical Mythology. Herodotus 1:60 says, "Of old the Hellenic race was marked off from the barbarian as more keen-witted and more free from nonsense." Greek and Roman mythology is quite generally supposed to show the way the human race thought and felt untold ages ago. Well, one race, maybe. Through it, according to this view, we can retrace the path from civilized man, who lives so far from nature, to man who lived in close companionship with nature. And the real interest of the myths is that they lead us back to a time when the world was young and people had a connection with the earth, with trees and seas and flowers and hills, unlike anything we ourselves can feel. When the stories were being shaped, we are given to understand little distinction had as yet been made between the real and the unreal. The imagination was vividly alive and not checked by reason, so that anyone in the woods might see through the trees a fleeing nymph, or, bending over a clear pool to drink, behold, in the depths, a Neon's face. Well, spiritual beings, the idea that you could witness them doesn't mean that, you're going against reason. The prospect of traveling back to this delightful state of things is held out by nearly every writer who touches upon classical mythology, above all by the poets, in that infinitely remote time primitive man could have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wretched horn, his wreathed horn. And we for a moment can catch, through the myths he made, a glimpse of that strangely and beautifully animated world, but a very brief consideration of the ways of uncivilized peoples everywhere, and in all ages, is enough to prick that romantic bubble. Nothing is clearer than the fact that primitive man, whether in New Guinea today or aeons ago in the prehistoric wilderness, is not and never has been a creature who peoples his world with bright fancies and lovely visions. Horrors lurked in the primeval forest, not nymphs and naiads. Terror lived there, with its close attendant, magic, and, in its most common defense, human sacrifice. How can we say that's the most common defense? Mankind's chief hope of escaping the wrath of whatever divinities were then abroad lay in some magical rite, senseless but powerful, or in some offering made at the cost of pain and grief. There's a picture here. The Greeks, unlike the Egyptians, made their gods in their own image. Now, I'm not sure which of the woodcuts or however they did the pictures are actually in the older print, or whether it's part of the new print. So, the mythology of the Greeks, this dark picture, is worlds apart from the stories of classical mythology. The study of The way early man looked at his surroundings does not get much help from the Greeks. How briefly the anthropologists treat the Greek myths is noteworthy. Of course, the Greeks, too, had their roots in the primeval slime. Of course, they, too, once lived a savage life, ugly and brutal. But what the myths show is how high they had risen above the ancient filth and fierceness by the time we have any knowledge of them. Only a few traces of that time are to be found in the stories. I would venture to say that the Greeks, once they became civilized, were more brutish and, we do not know when these stories were first told in their present shape, but whenever it was, primitive life had been left far behind. The myths, as we have them, are the creation of great poets. The first written record of Greece is the Iliad. Greek mythology begins with Homer, generally believed to be not earlier than 1,000 years before Christ. The Iliad is or contains the oldest Greek literature, and is written in a rich and subtle and beautiful language, which must have had behind it centuries when men were striving to express themselves with clarity and beauty, an indisputable proof of civilization. The tales of Greek mythology do not throw any clear light upon what early mankind was like. They do throw an abundance of light upon what early Greeks were like, a matter, it would seem, of more importance to us, who are their descendants, intellectually, artistically, and politically too. Nothing we learn about them is alien to ourselves. People often speak of the Greek miracle. What the phrase tries to express is the new birth of the world. With the awakening of Greece, old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. Something like that happened in Greece. Why it happened, or when, we have no idea at all. We know only that in the earliest Greek poets, a new point of view dawned, never dreamed of in the world before them, but never to leave the world after them. With the coming forward of Greece, mankind became the center of the universe, the most important thing in it. This was a revolution in thought. Human beings had counted for little heretofore. In Greece, man first realized what mankind was. The Greeks made their gods in their own image. Like the caption in the picture. That they had not entered the mind of man before, until then, gods had no semblance of reality. They were unlike all living things. In Egypt, a towering colossus, immobile, beyond the power of the imagination to endow with movement, as fixed in the stone as the tremendous temple columns, a representation of the human shape, deliberately made unhuman, or a rigid figure, a woman with a cat's head, suggesting inflexible, inhuman cruelty. Not quite or a monstrous, mysterious sphinx, aloof from all that lives. In Mesopotamia, bas-reliefs of bestial shapes, unlike any beast ever known, men with birds' heads, and lions with bulls' heads, and both with eagles' wings, creations of artists who were intent upon producing something never seen except in their own minds, the very consummation of unreality. Well, you could even say that these things are linguistic, right? That, the anthropomorphic heads mean something. I mean, there could be beings These and their like were what the pre-Greek world worshipped. One need only to place besides them in imagination any Greek statue of a god so normal and natural, with all its beauty, to perceive what new idea had come into the world. With its coming, the universe became rational. St. Paul said the invisible must be understood by the visible. That was not a Hebrew idea. It was Greek. Well, that idea was present among the Hebrews. It's the idea that God is, like us. It's less and less an idea depending on your type of Judaism that you're looking at, right? In Greece alone, in the ancient world, people were preoccupied with the visible. They were finding the satisfaction of their desires in what was actually in the world around them. The sculptor watched the athletes contending in the games, and he felt that nothing he could imagine would be as beautiful as those strong young bodies. So he made his statue of Apollo. The storyteller found Hermes among the people he passed in the street. He saw the entity like a young man at the age when youth is loveliest, as Homer says. Greek artists and poets realized how splendid a man could be. Straight and swift and strong, he was the fulfillment of their search for beauty. They had no wish to create some fantasy shaped in their own minds. All the art and all the thought of Greece centered in human beings. Well, we are the ones that incarnate the myths, right? So, human gods naturally made heaven a pleasantly familiar place. The Greeks felt at home in it. They knew just what the divine inhabitants did there, what they ate and drank, and where they banqueted, and how they amused themselves. Of course, they were to be feared. They were very powerful and very dangerous when angry. Still, with proper care, a man could be quite fairly at ease with them. He was even perfectly free to laugh at them. Zeus, who you don't have to personify Zeus, actually. Some of these names, just like the Egyptians and the Hindus and stuff, there were people who got beyond that part. Zeus, trying to hide his love affairs from his wife, and invariably shown up, was a capital figure of fun. The Greeks enjoyed him and liked him all the better for it. Hera was that stock character of comedy, the typical jealous wife, and her ingenious tricks to discomfit her husband and punish her rival, far from displeasing the Greeks, entertained them as much as Hera's modern counterpart does today. Such stories made for a friendly feeling, laughter in the presence of an Egyptian sphinx or an Assyrian bird beast was inconceivable, but it was perfectly natural in Olympus, and it made the gods companionable. On earth, too, the deities were exceedingly and humanly attractive. In the form of lovely youths and maidens, they peopled the woodland, the forest, the rivers, the sea, in harmony with the fair earth and the bright waters. That is the miracle of Greek mythology, a humanized world, men freed from the paralyzing fear of an omnipotent unknown. Now, that's not necessarily have to fear and hope, fear and hate in regard to God. Don't have to be paralyzing. The terrifying incomprehensibilities which were worshipped elsewhere, and the fearsome spirits with which earth, air, and sea swarmed, were banned from Greece. It may seem odd to say that the men who made the myths disliked the irrational and had a love for facts, but it is true no matter how wildly fantastic some of the stories are. Anyone who reads them with attention discovers that even the most nonsensical take place in a world which is essentially rational and matter-of-fact. Hercules, whose life was one long combat against preposterous monsters, is always said to have had his home in the city of Thebes, the exact spot where Aphrodite was born. Of the foam could be visited by any ancient tourist. It was just offshore from the island of Cythera. The winged steed Pegasus, after skimming the air all day, went every night to a comfortable stable in Corinth. A familiar local habitation gave reality to all the mythical beings. If the mixture seemed childish, consider how reassuring, how sensible the solid background is as compared with the genie who comes from nowhere when Aladdin rubs the lamp and his task accomplished returns to nowhere. I'm not sure that's quite how that story went, but the terrifying, irrational has no place in classical mythology. Magic, so powerful in the world before and after Greece, is almost non-existent. There are no men and only 2 women with the dreadful supernatural powers, the demoniac wizards and the hideous old witches who haunted Europe and America too, up to quite recent times, play no part at all in the stories. Well, the most popular stories, but Circe and Medea are the only witches, and they are young and of surpassing beauty, delightful, not horrible. Astrology, which has flourished from the days of ancient Babylon down to today, is completely absent from classical Greece. I don't know how people can believe that. There are many stories about the stars, but not a trace of the idea that they influence men's lives. Astronomy is what the Greek mind finally made out of the stars. Not a single story has a magical priest who is terribly to be feared because he knows the ways of winning over the gods or alienating them. The priest is rarely seen and is never of importance. In the Odyssey, when a priest and a poet fall on their knees before Odysseus, praying him to spare their lives, the hero kills the priest without a thought, but saves the poet. Homer says that he felt awe to slay a man who had been taught his divine art by the gods. Not the priest, but the poet had influenced with heaven, and no one was ever afraid of a poet. Ghosts, too, which have played so large and so fearsome a part in other lands, never appear on earth in any Greek story. I think there's examples, actually. The Greeks were not afraid of the dead. The Piteous dead, the Odyssey calls them. Well, not as much as like the Romans, so... The world of Greek mythology was not a place of terror for the human spirit. It is true that the gods were disconcertingly incalculable. One could never tell where Zeus's thunderbolt would strike. Nevertheless, the whole divine company, with a very few and for the most part not important exceptions, were entrancingly beautiful with a human beauty, and nothing humanly beautiful is really terrifying. The early Greek mythologists transformed a world full of fear into a world full of beauty. This bright picture has its dark spots. The change came about slowly and was never quite completed. The gods become human were, for a long time, a very slight improvement upon their worshippers. They were incomparably lovelier and more powerful, and they were, of course, immortal, but they often acted in a way that no decent man or woman would. In the Iliad, Hector is nobler by far than any of the heavenly beings, and Andromache infinitely to be preferred to Athena or Aphrodite. Well, the myths are about humans being the best that they can, right? Here, from first to last, is a goddess on the very low level of humanity. Almost every one of the radiant divinities could act cruelly or contemptibly. A very limited sense of right and wrong prevailed in Homer's heaven, and for a long time after, other dark spots too stand out. There are traces of a time when there were beast gods. The satyrs are goatmen, and centaurs half man, half horse. Hera is often called cow-faced, as if the adjective had somehow stuck to her through all her changes, from a divine cow to the very human queen of heaven. There are also stories which point back clearly to a time when there was human sacrifice, but what is astonishing is not that bits of savage belief were left here and there. The strange thing is that they are so few. The course of the mythical monster is present in any number of shapes: gorgons and hydras and chimeras dire. But they are there only to give the hero his meed of glory. What could a hero do in a world without them? They are always overcome by him, the great hero of mythology. Hercules might be an allegory of Greece herself. He fought the monsters and freed the earth from them, just as Greece freed the earth from the monstrous idea of the unhuman supreme over the human. Well, Greece, instead of minimizing fighting, made an order of it. So, defend yourself against the monsters and the raiders and whatnot, but you don't go off and just fight because you just want to spread your land and whatnot. That's one of the changes that Greece made, but to the world. Well, I mean, it didn't wait till Greece, but Greek mythology is largely made of stories about gods and goddesses, but it must not be read as a kind of Greek Bible, an account of the Greek religion. According to the most modern idea, a real myth has nothing to do with religion. Yeah, that's not even the biblical usage of the word. It is an explanation of something in nature. How, for instance, any and everything in the universe came to existence: man, animals, this or that tree or flower, the sun, the moon, the stars, storms, eruptions, earthquakes, and all that is and all that happens. Well, so a myth is, there's like a spiritual side to it or something. So basically, theory. Thunder and lightning are caused when Zeus hurls his thunderbolt. A volcano erupts because a terrible creature is imprisoned in the mountain, and every now and then struggles to get free. The Dipper, the constellation called also the Great Bear, does not set below the horizon because a goddess once was angry at it and decreed that it should never sink into the sea. Myths are early science, and the result of man's first trying to explain what they saw around them. But there are many so-called myths which explain nothing at all. These tales are pure entertainment. Well, until you figure out what is supposed to stir up, right? The sort of thing people would tell each other on a long winter's evening. The story of Pygmalion and Galatea is an example. It has no conceivable connection with any event in nature. Neither has the quest of the Golden Fleece. Nar, Orpheus, and Eurydice, Nar many another. This fact is now generally accepted, and we do not have to try to find in every mythological heroine the moon or the dawn, and in every hero's life a sun myth. The stories are early literature as well as early science, but religion is there too, in the background to be sure, but nevertheless plain to see from Homer through the tragedians, and even later, there is a deepening realization of what human beings need and what they must have in their gods. Zeus, the thunderer, was, it seems certain, once a rain god. He was supreme even over the sun, because a rocky Greece needed rain more than sunshine, and the god of gods would be the one who could give the precious water of life to his worshippers. But Homer's Zeus is not a fact of nature. He is a person living in a world where civilization has made an entry, and, of course, he has a standard of right and wrong. It is not very high, certainly, when it seems chiefly applicable to others, not to himself, but he does punish men who lie and break their oaths. He is angered by any ill treatment of the dead, and he pities and helps the old Priam when he goes as a suppliant to Achilles. In the Odyssey, he has reached a higher level. The swineherd there says that the needy and the stranger are from Zeus, and he who fails to help them sins against Zeus himself. Hesiod, not much later than the Odyssey, if at all, says of a man who does evil to the suppliant and the stranger, or who wrongs orphan children, with that man Zeus is angry. Then justice becomes Zeus's companion. That was a new idea. The buccaneering chieftains in the Iliad did not want justice. They wanted to be able to take whatever they chose because they were strong, and they wanted a god who was on the side of the strong. But Hesiod, who was a peasant living in a poor man's world, knew that the poor must have a just god. He wrote, "Fishes and beasts and fowls of the air devour one another, but to man Zeus has given justice. Besides Zeus, on his throne justice has her seat." These passages show that the great and bitter needs of the helpless were reaching up to heaven and changing the God of the strong into the protector of the weak. So, back of the stories and of the amorous Zeus, and a cowardly Zeus, and a ridiculous Zeus, we can catch sight of another Zeus coming into being as men grow continually more conscious of what life demanded of them and what human beings needed in the god they worshipped. Gradually, this Zeus displaced the others until he occupied the whole scene. At last, he became, in the words of Dio Chrysostom, who wrote during the 2nd century of the Common Era, "Our Zeus, the giver of every good gift, the common father and savior and guardian of mankind." What does that sound like? The Odyssey speaks of the divine for which all men long, and hundreds of years later, Aristotle wrote, "Excellence much labored for by the race of mortals." The Greeks from the earliest mythologies had a perception of the divine and the excellent. Their longing for them was great enough to make them never give up laboring to see them clearly, until at last the thundering and lightning were changed into the universal Father.